Hi, Ryan. We have with us here Dr. Ryan Gibson from University of Guelph, and I'd like to start off just asking you to tell us a little bit about yourself and your involvement in regional development.
Sure. I guess for myself, I'm at the University of Guelph and I teach in the School of Rural Planning and Development. And so my experiences right now is as a teacher teaching people about regional development and how that takes place. My background though is I grew up in the prairies of Manitoba, an agricultural area, and so I got to see regional development firsthand, seeing young people leave the communities, seeing agriculture fundamentally change from family farms to corporate farms. And so it's a very different landscape than what we see here in Newfoundland, but regional development was at its core. Not always a positive story though.
And you've done regional development work and research right across the country, haven't you, and even internationally. Maybe you tell people a little bit about some of the areas you've worked?
Yeah, I've been really fortunate. I've had the opportunity to work with places like the Rural Development Institute out of Brand New University and spent time working in regional development amongst communities and First Nations in the Yukon, British Columbia, Manitoba, and Nunavut. I've done work throughout Atlantic Canada, Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland and Labrador, and also internationally, predominantly in Ireland, but also in places like Hungary, where they're trying different new and innovative things.
Great. You've been involved with us on the research team looking at regional development approaches across the country. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about some of the changes you've seen in regional development in Canada and in our province over the last few years.
Yeah, we've got a lot of different changes that have been taking place, and particularly across the country we see lots of different themes, and so we should be really clear that we don't have kind of universal themes that are taking place across Canada. Place matters at the end of the day, and so what we see here in Newfoundland doesn't necessarily happen in British Columbia. Some of the things that come to my mind when I think of what are some of those big changes is the introduction of thinking about place and what's in a region, what are the assets in a region, and how can we mobilize those assets. And every region has different assets, and we have assets we sometimes want to mobilize, and we have also assets we don't want to mobilize for whatever the purpose might be. So thinking about place would be one of those things that we've done differently more recently. I'd say we've also changed the way we've done things in the sense that we've allowed for things to be done innovatively in different places. So we're no longer all trying to do the same. We're not trying to have a cookie cutter approach to how we're dealing with regional development. And so there's a recognition of what works in St. Anthony and the Northern Peninsula may not work for the Burin Peninsula at the end of the day.
Great.
The other one I'd point out is, and I see this a lot in a lot of our resource-based communities, is that during the 70s and 80s, most of our economic development and regional development strategies were about getting things out of communities. It was about getting fish out of the community. It was about getting timber, getting grain out of communities and moving it into the big cities or into the marketplace. And we're starting to see some different investments now around no longer trying to get things out, but trying to actually do something with those things to increase some of the value addedness to that community or region, which is exciting.
It is. Are there some particular examples of innovative practices that you've seen, places where they've done a really good job at some of those, either focusing on what they've got as unique assets or adding value to the resources, or some good examples you can point to or that you will be pointing to in your remarks over the next few days?
Yeah, I think we've got a lot of them, and unfortunately the stories aren't well told. And so one of the challenges, and I think one of the opportunities that we've had through the research project, is to tell some of those stories or to maybe amplify the message that they get out to new corners of the world. One of the groups that I've been involved with for a number of years now that's really quite innovative is the groups in Ireland, in South Kerry in particular, and they have a development organization that's based of all the member communities in a region, but rather than only do economic development, they're actually doing economic development, social development, cultural development, all packaged under one umbrella. And so they're developing projects that might deal with issues of social isolation. So single, largely older males living by themselves that maybe aren't connected. And so they're not looking at maybe an economic project, but they're looking at creating a program called the Rural Sheds, which brings those gentlemen together once a week so that they're coming in, they're actually creating wood products, birdhouses, benches, other community wood products that they can be sold. But at the end of the day, the primary purpose is actually about social isolation and getting people to come together so that people can join new networks, social networks at the end of the day. We also see programs around business development, but they have business development that also incorporates the environment, that incorporates social identity. And so the groups, regional economic development groups in Ireland have been a bit more holistic in how they've addressed regional development than we typically see here in Canada, where it's around economics or around the environment. And so that's been really interesting for myself. Another really interesting initiative that I'll talk about is communities that are looking to change their governance. And in particular, we have a whole series of municipalities and local service districts in rural areas across Canada, and I've been really interested to find out how some of those groups change their structures. So it might be around amalgamation, but more often it's actually around how do they partner and work with their neighbors, whether it's around joint service delivery, whether it's around creating a new entity. And that's been really exciting because there's a lot of diversity around how groups have done this. It's not easy for any of them. And so many have struggled, but we've learned a lot in their struggles. And so just yesterday, a group of 10 communities in New Brunswick decided to form a new entity that came together that will now be trying to figure out how to do that, how to govern that, and how does that new entity actually work with other groups in the region and in the province.
A lot of experimentation going on, I guess.
There is a lot of experimentation, but it's exciting to see groups wishing to spend the energy to change things, recognizing that what they're doing at the moment, the status quo, isn't giving them the opportunities that they're looking for.
So shift gears a little bit maybe and talk about the Northern Peninsula. We're here talking about the future of the Northern Peninsula. Do you have some thoughts on what you think a desirable future for the Northern Peninsula might look like 10 to 20 years from now? We're certainly going to be asking local residents and businesses and others about that, but do you have any thoughts you'd like to share on the future of the Northern Peninsula, the potential future for the Northern Peninsula?
It's a big question. I wish I had a crystal ball with the answer, but I don't. But I think for myself, having visited this area and done research and worked with a number of the groups, for me it's around sustainability. And how do you create a sustainable livelihood for the people that live here and want to be here? And what that looks is probably fundamentally different than what the region has historically looked like. But I don't know really what that all will entail. But I think that's part of both the excitement, is having groups of people that are coming together, like for the next couple of days, to start that conversation and have that dialogue around what are those priority areas, what are things that they really want to see happen, and how can we mobilize and facilitate that to actually take place. At the end of the day, you see economic, social, environmental changes taking place in this region, and they'll continue to take place. This globalization influence now means that communities like Plum Point aren't competing with St. Anthony for business. They're competing with China, Hong Kong, and Japan. And so we've got to rethink how we do some of the things. But there's lots of assets in this region that can be utilized, whether they're natural resources or whether they're the human capacity, the people that are here that have been innovating for hundreds of years, but maybe have never seen it as innovative or as a business opportunity. That's just what they've always done. So I think we've got some really exciting times.
You mentioned globalization as one external factor that's likely to affect the region going forward. Are there other external factors that you think we need to keep in mind as we talk about the future and its potential?
Absolutely. I wish it was just a list of one external factor. We've got a lot, no different than other regions, but you've got different levels of government as well. So you've got the role of the federal government, which we've seen at least some discussion around some fairly different changes taking place at the federal level, which will have all sorts of implications potentially for regions like the Northern Peninsula. Some examples of that are around the Infrastructure Development Bank that's been proposed, which would allow municipalities to be able to tap into funding to help with municipal infrastructure upgrades. That's a very different program than what we've seen in the past. That could actually be very positive for some regions. At the same time, we see shifting priorities within provincial and federal governments, and sometimes as they shift, they don't shift in parallel to where communities and regions want to be or where they think they should be. And so that can be a really big external factor that hinders the future development. We've got lots of other things that will take place, whether it's the European Trade Agreement that was negotiated that's going to fundamentally change how Canada ships products, particularly for this region, seafood and fish products, into Europe. And so we've got lots of these externalities, but within each of them, there are also opportunities. And that's the other piece that we have to kind of keep our finger on the pulse, is that they're not just negative. They might actually create new markets for products that we're already developing.
Sure, and I think Terry Bennell is going to talk tomorrow about the port and fisheries and some of the opportunities associated with the free trade agreement. So that'll be great, the European Trade Agreement. You've talked about governance a little bit. Do you see changes in governance coming for the region, or changes in how government services are going to be offered in the future in the region?
I would hope so.
Again, knowing you don't have a crystal ball, but what do you think some of the changes are that might be ahead?
Well, that's it. My first reaction is I would hope there's changes. And I say that purely from a perspective of the Northern Peninsula is not the same as it used to be in the 1960s. Things have changed, and our governance systems need to change with that. And so we should be looking at alternative governance mechanisms. And so part of that, and part of what I'll be chatting about on Friday morning, is looking at how do we change the relationship between communities and government. At the moment, we've largely seen communities as being a client of government services, going to government for permission. How do we shift that dynamic to make communities empowered to be a partner, where community and government are working together around common goals and opportunities? So that'll be interesting. I think there's also a strong movement in this region. We've heard it from mayors of communities, we've heard it from nonprofit organizations, from regional economic development organizations, an appetite for doing things differently. And whether that is regional service provisions, whether that's joining forces on different opportunities. The region had the Northern Peninsula Pilot Initiative for a number of years that was very successful in terms of bringing people to the table, having a conversation around what it could be and what it might look like. And I think there was a lot learned in that process. And I understand that that's really kind of a foundation that we can continue on and build from around what those new governance mechanisms might be. But at the end of the day, I surely hope we move on into governance 2.0 in the Northern Peninsula and elsewhere in Canada.
So how important do you think it is for communities in the area to work together as a region in that going forward?
Fundamental. At the end of the day, communities, whether you've got 3,000 people or 300 people, at the end of the day, all have similar challenges and opportunities. And the simple opportunities of being able to connect with your neighbors, to have a common voice around political processes, but even also just around sharing good practices and best practices is really quite fundamental. And so I would hope that communities are kind of moving into an era of more collaboration, not seeing each other as competitors for government grants, and looking for opportunities to work together. I absolutely recognize the fact that working together is not easy. It's time consuming. And it's built on trust and relationships, and those can change with people changing. Other events can also influence how those relationships work, and so they take time, and that's incredibly difficult these days when everything is at a very fast pace. It's email based, that we still need to carve out time for process and ensuring that people can come, they can meet, they can build that trust at the end of the day. So collaboration going to be really, really important. How it works, always an interesting discussion, but in a sense, when I look to some of the communities that have done it really well, sometimes it's around picking the low-hanging fruit, picking initiatives that can get people to work together really easily, that don't threaten anybody. So some examples I have, in other places in Canada, we've seen groups buy computers together. And so rather than every individual municipality buying a new office computer at the local computer store for $2,000, they're able to do a bulk purchase of maybe a dozen computers, and perhaps they save $200 or $300. Small things, but that sort of relationship, that experience can maybe lend itself to bigger things down the road, whether it's joint road construction, whether it's snow removal or garbage collection, or whether it's around regional development.
Great. I think there's some good suggestions there for how local actors involved in regional development might move forward, things to think about. If you were to be in a position maybe to influence provincial or federal policy related to rural and regional development, do you have some suggestions you might make, things you'd like to see changed at the sort of policy and program level around regional and rural development?
So two come to my mind. One is around looking at that governance 2.0. What does that mean? And my maybe recommendation is for government to not be threatened by that. It's the wishing to change is not an accusation that government is wrong or bad, but rather that we need to continue to evolve with the reality of our communities. And so for government not to be feeling threatened by the fact that communities would like to change how they govern themselves. Conversely, we also need to have the same relationship with communities, to not feel threatened about looking or at least exploring what a new governance might be on that side of things. So I think we need to go into it fairly open-minded and with the ability to explore and to move forward with whatever makes sense. And it might look different for different places.
Recognize each other's constraints and
right.
and abilities.
And we've got communities that are they're raring to go about economic development, and they're looking to bring in new businesses, start some new entrepreneurship opportunities. But we also have communities that struggle to keep the lights on. And we need to recognize that we have that great diversity in our communities. And so for some communities, it might be they're willing to look at governance 2.0 today. For some, it might be tomorrow, and for others, it might maybe be a year or two away from this. But we shouldn't feel threatened feeling we have to participate or we need to engage in it. The other one that's a personal project of mine is to look at wealth. Our rural regions have an incredible amount of wealth in it. We just don't see it most of the time. And that wealth might be, we think immediately to personal bank accounts, but it's also things like assets we own, houses, equipment, boats, fishing quotas perhaps. And there's a real amount of wealth in these regions. But at the end of the day, when we start to think about how that wealth moves, we don't have any sort of provincial policies or programs to encourage wealth to stay place-based. So I think of my family, when my parents pass away, 50% of their wealth will go to myself in Guelph, Ontario, and 50% will go to Calgary, Alberta, and the community where my family made their wealth will receive nothing, and it'll all disappear. And I think there's an opportunity for governments to encourage communities to tap into that intergenerational wealth transfers and to really explore how we can keep wealth within communities, and then to explore then how communities can utilize that wealth for their sustainability, for their viability, and their revitalization.
Through mechanisms such as community foundations, I guess.
So community foundations would be one. You also have, they come in a variety of names. It could be a benevolent society. It could be a trust, a community trust. But at the end of the day, it would be a community or regional held bank account whereby you put money in, but at the end of the day, the money that's donated isn't spent, it's invested, and the money generated from interest on that investment is then utilized within the community. And so it gives some long-term sustainability funding that really is derived and directed by community.
Great. I think that's a great opportunity for people who are passionate about the communities where they were raised or spent a lot of their working life to put something back. So certainly worth exploring further.
That's right.
Thanks, Ryan.